everyone. Let me start by thanking Gabriel, Ted, and Paulo for the kind invitation. It's truly an honor to be here moderating a panel with such distinguished guests. As you all know, Brazil will go through, I would argue, the most decisive elections in recent history. In times of car wash, a very polarized political environment, and a still challenging economic recovery, Brazilians will be voting for president, governor, state and federal legislature. And without further ado, let me introduce the distinguished panelists we have with us today. To my extreme right, with no ideological connotation, of course, we have Chris Garman, the Managing Director for the Americas at Eurasia Group. Also to my right, Ricardo Senes, who's the Managing Partner of Prospectiva and a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. To my left, we have Mauricio Moura, the founder and CEO of Ideia Big Data and a visiting scholar at George Washington University. And to my left, also, Tiago Ramargo. Tiago also actually wears two hats. He'll be speaking here as the co-founder of Agora movement, which is an independent movement founded by young professionals from the private and public sector who will be launching a number of candidacies in this year's election. But Tiago is also the National Secretary for Digital Policies of the Ministry of Science, Technology, Innovations, and Communications. Let me start. What I'll do, I'll pose a question for each of the panelists to get started with the discussion. And I'll start with Chris. Chris, one of the key questions, I think, for Brazilians and non-Brazilians alike is, will Brazil be in a better position to pass structural reforms after the 2018 elections, right? And you've been dedicating a lot of time thinking about this, and you came up with the concept of the quasi-reformer candidates, right? Mm-hmm. Can you explain us what is this concept exactly, and what are the odds of a quasi-reformer winning in October, and what would that mean exactly?
Yes. Well, thank you very much. First and foremost, it's a tremendous pleasure to be here on such a distinguished panel at an absolutely fascinating time in Brazilian politics. It seems as if I actually make that introduction in almost every event over the past 3 to 4 years. It's an extraordinary time in Brazilian politics. Yeah, good question. Listen, I think that in looking at the field of candidates, the one thing that comes out is just the very large number and multiplicity of candidacies, right, across the ideological spectrum. But, the reason why we denominated the term quasi-reformist is more to try to simplify the field from an investor and a market perspective. Ultimately, trying to identify buckets of candidates on their degree of commitment and ability to deliver on reforms, right? So I think that we can talk about your classic reformist candidates, which would include Geraldo Alckmin, the governor from the former governor of São Paulo from the PSDB, President Michel Temer, who says he's going to run for re-election, he probably won't. Henrique Meirelles, Rodrigo Maia. These are all names in which we know these candidates are earnestly committed to needed structural economic reforms and hold the political conditions to approve them in Congress. And then what we have is the field of candidates, which we call kind of the anti-reformers, or at least these are candidates who are going to campaign in part in opposition to the agenda that this administration has endorsed. Now, they're all talking about some version of reforms, but they will generate serious doubts over their commitment to move forward on reforms and approve them in Congress. And that's your candidates on the left, right, which would be Ciro Gomes on the one hand and anyone from the PT on the other. We can have the conversation that maybe these candidates are not as bad as the markets would imply them to be, which I am actually sympathetic to, but nevertheless, it is a different scenario, right? And then what we denominate, which is this middle group of candidates, which we call the quasi-reformists, right? These are candidates who are going to say market-friendly things. They're going to defend needed economic adjustments, but there will be doubts over their true commitment to that agenda, and there will be meaningful doubts over their ability to generate a coalition in Congress to get them approved right? Because a lot of the adjustments that Brazil needs require constitutional reforms. And here we put Joaquim Barbosa in that camp, Jair Bolsonaro in that camp, Marina Silva in that camp, Álvaro Dias in that camp, right? They have different ideological positions, but they have that trait in common. Now, when we look at the election, our bets are within someone in this middle group. We attribute a 45% odds of one of these quasi-reformists winning. We think the least likely victor is probably someone on the left, the anti-reformists, 20% odds. And in the traditional reformist camp, we give a 35% odds. We're not giving odds in individual names because it's just tough, but more kind of buckets of candidates. And why is it that when we look at the field, that we give a larger weight, and our bets are probably someone within this quasi-reformist bucket is likely to come out on top? And the simple reason is that they tend to align better with the profile of voter demands. What unifies this bucket, these are all candidacies who have more credibility in terms of presenting themselves as somebody that will change the way that politics is done, more credibility on the anti-corruption platform, and mixture of renewal with experience, right? And how do we get to that conclusion? And I think here we have a couple, I just want to show you a couple data slides. The one thing that really stands out about this election in Brazil is that, there's a lot of chatter about kind of anti-establishment mood in the United States and Europe, right? The big conversation after the election cycle in 2016 in developed markets was, what are the roots of this severe disgruntlement amongst the lower middle class that generated the Trump election in the United States, the Brexit referendum in UK. But when you look at global public opinion data and you look at metrics to try to measure the extent to which voters believe that the system is broken, right? That the degree of anger that we're seeing in Latin America and Brazil specifically is as high or higher than those same metrics suggested prior to the U.S. election that elected Donald Trump and also the Brexit referendum in the UK. There are a battery of questions that you can try to be able to measure this. I gave a little bit of a sample. This is from a global survey of Ipsos Public Affairs, and you ask questions like, do you agree with the following statement? Traditional parties and politicians don't care about people like me. The global average, which is heavily concentrated in OECD, 63% agree. In Brazil, 68%. To fix this country, we need a strong leader willing to break the rules if necessary. 43% agree with that statement. Trust in the media and political parties and institutions are at an all-time low, right? So from a comparative point of view, what we see is that indicators of disenchantment and anger against the political class are running very high in Brazil. This is in November of 2016, okay? So Ipsos ran another poll at the end of last year with these same questions. And what we see is that the depthness of the disenchantment has only gotten worse, right? When you ask the question that to fix Brazil, we need a strong leader willing to break the rules if necessary, right? This was now at 70%, up from 43%. Brazil's economy is rigged to the benefit of the rich and powerful, again, 86%, up from 69% in 2016, right? The mass media is more interested in making money than telling the truth. 84% agree with that statement. This is a national face-to-face poll, right? And what's our hypothesis here? And you look at other public opinion data points here and say, what's the sentiment that best represents your feeling towards the future of the country? The sum of disgust and concern gets to close to 90% of respondents, right? And you look at kind of the levels of disapproval ratings of all the major politicians in the country, almost all of them are above 50% disapprove of these leaders. The thesis that we're defending here is that we're in the middle of a phenomena that we like to call kind of a middle-class dilemma. We went through a tremendous increase in the size of the middle class during the commodity booms. The issues that voters cared about have shifted from jobs and employment towards the quality of public services, education, health, security, right? And so the challenge that we're living with in Brazil is that these new demands have come to the fore when the ability of politicians to deliver on those demands have gone down. And when you add an economic crisis and a historic corruption scandal in Lava Jato, the issue of corruption is seen as intertwined in your ability to deliver on these services. So the nature of this disenchantment goes well beyond economics. It's not a cyclical economic recovery that's going to turn the tide on this type of disenchantment. So our thesis is that when you look at this election, even if we are in an economic recovery, that's not really going to help turn the nature of this anger, right? And then the question is, okay, well, who can best ride this level of discontent and anger, right? And that this kind of quasi-reformist bucket, if you look at Jair Bolsonaro, he is tapping into something real. He has one of the most, outside of Lula, the most loyal base of supporters out there. That says something about the mood of the electorate at this juncture. You look at the fact that Joaquim Barbosa, he announced his candidacy, right? And in a very low-key fashion on the week that Lula was being arrested, and he's already at 10% in the polls, right? Ahead of Geraldo Alckmin, who is better known from a national point of view. If you look at national name recognition, he's not as well known as Geraldo Alckmin, right? You look at Marina Silva, inheriting more of Lula's voters. Again, she fits within this profile of a politician that is conducting things a bit differently. A lot of this campaign, I think, in terms of the debate on this table, may very well hinge on, well, what speaks louder? Is it the nature of what voters are demanding and what candidates best match up with that? Or is this campaign going to be dictated by candidates who have more television time, money, party resources? Because if you put more weight on those variables, then Geraldo Alckmin has a real shot, right? In fact, we're at 35% for someone like Alckmin winning because we are putting weight on those variables. If it weren't for those variables, he'd be much lower than 35%, right? Now, I think that from our point here, just to set up a little bit of the debate going forward, is that where we land is that these variables matter, but they matter less than they have had in previous elections for a couple of reasons. Number one, this is going to be an election that is going to be shorter. Rather than a 90-day election, we're in a 45-day election cycle with changes in the kind of the TSC rules for governing these elections. The television time will drop from 45 days to 35 days, right? Number two, the federal Supreme Court prohibited the ability of companies to donate money to the campaigns. So we're going to have a 70 to 80% reduction in the amount of money financing these campaigns. From a presidential election point of view, this is a phenomenon where everyone gets poorer. Right? You add all those things up together, the barriers to entry are lower, right? So those variables matter, but less. And finally, we're in an environment where the role of social media is also growing tremendously, right? Voters are getting their information not only from your traditional media channels. That's exactly what explains why Bolsonaro is at 17 to 18% without ever having run for office in the first place, right? Again, that tends to reduce the relative advantage of these traditional variables. So the point is that when we look at this election and we think about structural economic reforms, you know, our bet is that we're going to get somebody that will be committed to these reforms, right? But the requisite for them winning office, which is to commit to conduct politics in a different way, i.e. not distributing cabinet positions to get a coalition in Congress, may hinder their ability to get these reforms done. I think that what's at stake is not whether the reform agenda will move forward, it's the pace and depth by which these reforms are going to get done. I think that even if someone in the quasi-reformist bucket wins, we're going to get some version of pension reform. But it's not going to be as deep and as broad if we were to get someone like Geraldo Alckmin elected to office.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Let me move to Senis, and Senis, I know Prospectiva has been for quite some time saying that people are underestimating Alckmin, that for some of those reasons that Chris mentioned, having a huge party machine, the capacity to build coalitions, public financing, this will at some point kick in and propel Alckmin and make him a much more competitive candidate. The last poll I've seen from Poder 360, Alckmin is still polling at something like 8%, which is remarkably low for the governor of São Paulo, former governor of São Paulo. Walk us through the argument that you guys see for, you know, the Alckmin campaign gaining momentum over the next couple of months or so.
Okay, let me start saying that I'm very glad to be here. It's a pleasure to be here with friends and colleagues. And my first comment, I think, goes in the direction that I'm impressed with the organization of this seminar that include the previous panel on agribusiness before discussing elections. That, I think, presents amazingly well how Brazil has been operating in the last, I think, decades. We have a tremendous good news in some areas of the country. One of them is the middle class boom, etc. Other issue is agribusiness. The other is IT. Caio mentioned a tremendous boom on IT in Brazil. So we are talking about a situation in terms of the election in Brazil, in a situation that we have this tremendous clash among different trends. Some of trends is amazingly good, and some of them are not that good or even very bad. For instance, this really depends on how you take the point of view about that. Is the corruption and this corruption scandal a disaster for Brazil, or is this a good news, in a sense that the first time that we have an impeachment process and a bunch of politicians and businessmen in jail because the capacity of the institutions to follow these powerful men in Brazil is something really new. So I think we are, the puzzle here is try to understand this election as we understand is the last election of the cycle of the Brazilian socio-economic and political cycle that starts in the democratization process. We are, in our perspective, would be the last election of the cycle, not the first election of the next cycle. The leaders like Thiago, etc., from Agora, etc., these people will be key people in 4 years, in a sense that they will set the agenda. Not, in my sense, actually the perspective sense, not in this election, but in the next election. Why am I saying that? Because we are taking a perspective on this election in which, as we presented in the former meeting, the last meeting that we have together, we consider 4 different factors that will be essential to take in consideration to understand this election and the potential of Alckmin in this election. The first factor, the variable, is the socioeconomic climate. So how the economy will be performing, the employment rate, the safety, all these issues that is, around the citizens in order to evaluate how they understand that the life, or his own life, the life of his family, etc., is improving or not in the short and middle term. The second variable is what we call in Prospectiva, the ideological distribution of Brazil. And in Brazil, we have a kind of ideological distribution that's a normal curve. We have just few people in the extremes, in both sides, in the right and the left. And the majority of Brazilian society is in the middle. Central right, middle, center, or center left. So 80% of the voters in Brazil, they set themselves in the middle. So this is the second factor. The third factor is, now we are back in the issue that Chris raised. Is this election 100% related to the attributes that the candidate have? Or we are talking in an election in which attributes are essential, but we need to combine this with not traditional, but the way of political parties, local leaders, mayors operates in Brazil during the elections. We consider that the new phenomena like social media, etc., even this general mood about the very bad mood that we have in Brazil, they do have a role. But we understand that there is not dominant role for the decision during the election. All the polls are indicating right now some, huge, some outsiders, or that can be an alternative, a potential alternative. But I would say that they are not measuring elections. They're still measuring mood. They are still thinking about how your general perception about the election would be, but not necessarily the election. We take the risk in our scenario, the basic scenario, that the election will be defined 2 months before the election itself. So this would be the real political decision-make process. not exactly 6 months before. So this is more or less how we understand. So it's 4 factors. It's the socioeconomic climate, the ideological distribution, access to resource. In resource for election in Brazil, it's electoral fund, time in TV, and political party structure. And finally, the 4th would be the attributes of the candidates. So when you take all these in consideration, we understand that in Brazil, we will still have a likelihood of a center-right guy to be the next president. Not just to reach the runoff, but also win the runoff. In this case, as we are in this field, or in this area of the center-right in Brazil, we have right now 8 or 9 different candidates. And these candidates they have right now support between 5% to 15%. We know that the challenge that we have to answer is how these 8 or 9 candidates that right now have 5 to 15% support, how will the best option among these guys? We understand that the best options among these guys would be the one who will be able to build a coalition in order to guarantee for himself, first, present himself as the last worst alternative, not the best alternative, and even the second best, but the last worst alternative. And second, that would be able to collect and combine resource in terms of money, access to this electoral fund, that in Brazil this year will be 1.7 billion, depend of the scenario about this coalition, center-right coalition, you can project that this guy, like Alckmin, may access from 1.7 billion, 1.1 billion through this coalition. Second, how many time, how would be the time distribution on this election concerning the center-right? I understand, again, if you take the scenario in which Alckmin managed to build some kind of coalition, he will at least have access to 1/3 of the time TV during the election. And finally, if he managed to combine all the political parties' structure of PSDB, Democrats, part of the PMDB, PTB, PSD, PPS. So we are talking about a kind of coalition of 7 or 8 different political parties. These people will have a huge capacity to access local leaders, mayors, candidates from the state level, parliament, etc. And this will make a difference in the end of the process. But this is our basic scenario. We are not saying that there is a 100% chance of Alckmin to be there, but we consider that we have something around 50% of the chance of this guy to be elected. Again, it's a puzzle. It's something that we have to decide what would be the model, an analytic model that we will take for understanding what's going on in Brazil right now. And from our understanding, that was the reasons why we continue to see Alckmin. But my 2 comments, final comments. One, of course, I'm very, myself and the Perspectiva team, we are very affected by some of the issues that Mauricio raised about the Barbosa. Barbosa as a kind of combination of Lula and Moro attributes. So this is very impact, I think. And the second is another information that I share with Mauricio, that was how the campaign of Alckmin is better organized right now. They have not been able to build a real team to manage his campaign. These, I think, is 2 factors that really can impact the capacity of Alckmin to build this coalition and run this election. But so far, I think you still have this scenario as a basic scenario. Thank you.
Mauricio, I'm curious about the Moro-Lula mix, but first, let me ask you, you have enormous experience. working with campaigns in Brazil and doing big data and polling for them. This campaign will be different in many ways, right? Some of the factors were mentioned here, such as public financing will be the key source of financing for all candidates. Corporations cannot donate money for candidates or parties. You have been arguing that things like TV time are mattering less than they used to. And also the time for the campaign will be only 45 days, so starting in mid-August. What is the impact for someone who's trying to run for re-election or something like that? What changes now, and what do you predict will be kind of the outcome of the election?
Good morning. Thanks for the invitation. First of all, I always like to be in a panel with my colleagues here, especially Ricardo, because he's very optimistic. So every time I listen to him, I say, wow, there is a way. So seriously, and I always tell him, I hope you are right, because you have the best scenario. But what I see on the ground is kind of different. One thing that I tell about the 2018 election is that voters in Brazil are very mad. It's kind of a fire and fury election. I don't know if you guys are familiar with those kind of elections, and I'll bring some numbers here. First of all, I strongly agree that corruption is going to be a big issue for this election. We have a survey that say that 62% of Brazilians would be willing not to vote for a candidate involved in the Lava Jato scandal. I'm not talking about conviction, about only if you are mentioned in the Lava Jato scandal, Lava Jato is going to be a real liability for any candidate. That's the first point. The second point, 57% of the voters will be willing to vote for an outsider for president. That number, when we run that same question in 2014, was 25%. So this is an outsider election. And a lot of focus groups that we run, we always ask people what would be the ideal candidate for president? And I'm going to read the sentence that I hear from the south to the north. The ideal candidate is the one that is different from everything that is out there. So that's the best definition I got, and that's a consensus. And on top of that, one thing that Lava Jato left is that all the big parties in Brazil are considered corrupt. So there's no more the comparison. This party is more corrupt than the other one. And one question that we gave was that 77% of the voters think that the next president would not be from PT or PMDB or PSDB. So for the first time we run a chance to have, like, for example, a second round with candidates not from the main parties. That happened in France last year. So the main parties didn't go to the second round. And on top of this, on the corruption side, we asked what would be the ideal attributes, the most important attributes for the candidate. And 45% say it's honesty and transparency. So honesty in this election is going to be something different, not like an assumption, but like an asset. So a candidate that repeats that he's not at Lava Jato and he's honest, there's it's much more important than 4 years ago. The second point, this is not only about the economy. We used to have presidential elections in Brazil that the most important issue was the economy. So this one, on top of corruption, we're going to have public security on a presidential agenda. Public security should be on a state-level agenda. In any election that I work at, we used to discuss a lot the violence and security. But in Brazil right now, the middle and small cities are suffering from issues of violence, drugs, and security. And on top of that, with the real intervention, that became a presidential issue. So there's going to be a lot of discussions in terms of security. And so this is the second point. The third point that Roberto asked me, what I think would be different. First of all, TV is losing ground of importance. I always work in political campaigns, and politicians love to think that TV is the most important thing, but it's not anymore. I have a number. First time I run some numbers about TV audience. In 2008, in the highest day of audience, we had about 25 points of audience on TV, on the political program. In 2016, the highest point was 6 points. So in 10 years, they lost about 20 points in audience. Of course, now in Brazil, we have like 30-second spots that are very popular here in the US. But anyway, the people are not watching TV and not what politicians in TV. And every time I run a survey, I ask people, do you want to see more politicians in TV or less politicians in TV? So sometimes having 10 minutes on TV, I work in a campaign in 2012 that we had 60 minutes. And I said, oh my God, we're going to show a politician for 60 minutes. So this is tough. And but it's still important. Of course, it's important to have TV time, to have the spots. Nobody says it's not important, but it's losing importance. And one thing that I'm seeing in Brazil, and I also see in the Mexico election right now, is that the main social media will not be Facebook, but will be WhatsApp. In Brazil, there's a lot of family discussions in WhatsApp. So people discuss family issues and politics in WhatsApp. So I think there's the political environment will be held on a WhatsApp. And as we estimate, because we don't have the official number from Facebook, that in Brazil we have about 66 million active WhatsApp users. And most of them have family groups. So the politicians will have to communicate through the WhatsApp, and most of the discussion will be held in WhatsApp. WhatsApp, you can share videos, you can share audio. So for me, the Brazil is going to reflect what's happening in Mexico right now. So the main social media will be WhatsApp, including the fact that for Facebook now you have to pay to get any kind of return on your ads. So this is going to be the big difference. Another point, the campaign will be short, so we don't have time to present a candidate during the campaign. The candidates will have to be known. And of course, as of today, most of the candidates are known by the population. I think only Bolsonaro was not a presidential candidate before. From the top candidates, Alckmin was candidate, Marina was candidate, Ciro was candidate. So we need, if the outsider presents himself, and then we can talk later about Joaquim Barbosa, he has to be known. So there is no space for to build someone from the scratch, from the ground. So, and one thing to also, the key point of this election would be the fact that Lula has 30 points on the polls, and 1/3 of the voters are not going. I'm going to be looking for an alternative for the other candidate. So my guess would be that to understand what Lula voters are going to do, it's going to be critical to predict who is going to be in the second round. And as of today, from our surveys, we think that any candidate from the Work Party, from PT, that has support from Lula can go up to 10 points very easily, and then after that it's going to be very hard. Some 1/3 of Lula voters are going to those center left or left candidates like Marina, Ciro, and the other more extreme left candidates. And it's one thing that strikes me is that the other third, some of the voters, of Lula voters, the second option is Bolsonaro, especially in Rio. In Brazil, 1 out of the 10 Lula voters go to Bolsonaro as second option. In Rio, 4 out of the 10 Lula voters go to Bolsonaro. And when we ask them why, they say because of the security and all the issues, proposals that Bolsonaro supposedly have about security. So that's the big picture. Before I finish, I wanna say how important is the movement that Thiago is building. He's going to talk about it. And because Agora has 2 things that I think it's forward-looking in Brazil. First one is that they have more a center vision about public policy issues. And one thing about Agora that I really appreciate is that diversity is an asset in the group. So they have people with different backgrounds. And if someone here votes in Brazil, some members of Agora will be candidates for Congress, especially I invite you guys to know about the movement and to know about the people that makes that movement. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Mauricio. So I'll pass to Thiago. And I think, Thiago, it would be interesting to hear from you, how does the new movement tries to, launch several campaigns at the same time? The headline of Estadão this Sunday was that 90% of the members of the lower house in Brazil, the Câmara dos Deputados, will be running for re-election. Obviously, this has a lot to do with their demand for foro privilegiado to escape prosecution in car wash-related matters. How do you compete with, these very experienced politicians when you're 30 or 40-something, you have great ideas, many of you are educated here in the United States, but how you come about to win an election?
First of all, I think that I should lower the expectations because I'm not as good as those guys are, and and maybe not as good as they could lead you to believe so. Okay, it's a good question. How are we going to do it? 9% will run for re-election, and we have those expectations of renewal of the seats of the lower house, especially of the lower house. But renewal itself is not enough. In 2010, we had 46% of the lower house seats renewed. And that was the Congress that gave us the mensalão. In 2014, we had 43% of the seats renewed, and that was the Congress that gave us the petrolão. So renewal itself is not enough. And renewal is not about age. It's not about this age window where you are not the top shot of your firm or your political background, or you are too young to understand how things are happening. You can renew the action having 20, 30, 40, 50, and so forth. I believe that what differentiates Agora from other movements and political institutions, political bodies as political parties, is because we are a bunch of accomplished professionals that decided to stop talking about it and start acting about it. So the first thing that we commit when we join the Agora movement is to give at least 2 years of your life to the public service. It may be running for office, or it may be as appointed to any job. So all the professionals of Agora are now committed to give at least 2 years of their lives to the public service. And that's the way that we could attract not only accomplished professionals, but people with real impact on society. I'm a big fan of an Asian and classic art form called comic books. And there's this Avengers movie, the first one, and there's Loki, the god of treachery and misleading, and he says to the Iron Man, okay, I have power, I have a legion of followers, and the Iron Man says, we have a hook. And that's the same thing with Agora. We have a hook. We have a guy with a great fan base, a great audience, 40 million people in his audience, and he is now pledging to try to change how things are done in Brazilian politics. And that's a big thing. When you can attract someone with that size, with that importance to society, to pledge himself trying to change things in Brazil, it's because maybe we have a way to get things done in a faster fashion that we had in mind. Just like Ricardo, since I'm an optimist, we can start the optimistic caucus right now. And the reason I am an optimist is because I've never heard or read about any billionaire that wasn't an optimistic guy or girl. I will probably never be a billionaire, but at least I will have something in common with them. And the reason that I keep my optimistic self is because I believe that things are always changing for the best landscape. We have situational advantages. Lower money, a fewer legitimate source of funding, the pivotal role that social media and the internet have on the changing the communications flow, but it's also not enough. I don't have those numbers, I have others. 45% of Brazilian people has no access to internet, has no internet access, 45%. Last year was the first year where the free TV gained viewers. The first year in more than a decade. So just the situational advantage won't be enough. Also, the legitimate money has decreased, but the not legitimate money is also there. We have two big institutions in Brazil, two loved institutions, church and football, the real one with foot and a ball. And, we need to explain that here. And the mayor of Rio de Janeiro is someone from the church. The mayor from Belo Horizonte is someone from a football club. And they have tools to have cash, money in cash, and can make it flow around. So the situational advantage won't be enough. So we have a plan. We have a plan to 2030, and by then we want to listen, to speak, to act, and we want to get in touch with the Brazilian population, and we are already doing that. We have today 6,000 volunteers, 50,000 followers, and we are acting on public square, 55. Mauricio knows better than me. I don't have Facebook, I'm that kind of guy. And, but we are on public squares, we are on the countryside, we are in virtually every state. We have men, women with all different backgrounds trying to get in touch with the population, trying to get to know what the Brazilian people really thinks what will be a best Brazil. And we aim to build a more inclusive, with less inequality Brazil, with more opportunities to everyone. But I believe that everyone says that they want to do that. The different thing about us, we want to do that in an evidence-based policy-making method. We are relying on data, we are relying on knowledge, and that's how we will beat the old caciques, and that's how we plan to build better policies. To take down the old bosses of the Brazilian politics, maybe we are not a key agent right now, Ricardo, as you said, but justice is doing that job. So justice is helping us, and I believe that as a Lava Jato-free group of people, we can take the spoils of this legal war we are facing right now and build a better communication flow with society to show that there's ways to get things done in a clean fashion, in an ethic fashion, in a socially responsible manner. So that's what we aim, and that's we are building right now.
Great.
So the conclusion is Ricardo is a billionaire, so that's the conclusion.
That's, thank you, Thiago. This was really interesting. I think Mauricio mentioned it briefly, and I wanted to ask Chris and Senis a question. I'll ask a couple of questions before we move to Q&A. And my question is about the elephant in the room, and I see that we actually have an elephant in the room here, which is Lula. And Thiago, of course, mentioned car wash, and clearly the strategy of the Workers' Party right now is to make sure Lula remains a candidate as much as possible, right, until mid-August or maybe even later. How do you guys see his capacity to actually transfer votes and make a successor who's highly competitive and can, you know, pass the threshold and make it to the runoff?
No, that's a great question. I mean, listen, I think that our views align somewhat with what Mauricio outlined, which is, you know, on the one hand, of course, Lula, you know, the PT's electoral strategy is to try to try to propagate the narrative of him being a political victim to these investigations, politicize the investigations, and try to fight for his candidacy for as long as possible. It seems more a pro forma overture to do so. You can register your bid on the 15th of August, which gives the Electoral Tribunal a short window to be able to shoot it down, which is highly likely. And then in a context where Lula's kind of image remains with a high dose of political capital, you can pass the baton on to a successor, which the PT now is probably Fernando Haddad. Jacques Wagner is in trouble in the car wash scandal. But ultimately, I think that our view is that he's probably not going to be the kingmaker, because when you do polls today and you ask, would you vote for someone that Lula endorses, and anywhere from 16 or more % of the voters say, yes, I will vote for whoever Lula supports. But this isn't a pre-election period where you're not necessarily seeing the candidates and the alternatives. So this isn't a very good gauge, right? So what can we look at? We can look at the fact that in the electorate we have 19% of voters identify themselves as being from the PT. PT is the only party that's got a high party identification, right? So I fully agree with Mauricio that any candidate of the PT can probably get to 10%, right? Then the issue is you have to get a candidate that has good attributes to be able to capture a larger share of this PT voting base. And here I have my doubts. I think Jacques Wagner could have been a good candidate if he hadn't gotten in trouble in the investigations. He's from the Northeast. The bulk of Lula's votes are in the Northeast. So you need somebody that can be competitive in that region. Fernando Haddad isn't. So I don't think the PT has got very good names to be able to fish within Lula's electoral base. So of the 19% Pichistas, I would say half of them go to someone within the PT. Then the question is, well, who else? Where can they go to, right? And Marina Silva benefited more because she's more known. Right, so she was the name recall is higher. That's why she benefited a larger share of the Datafolha pollsters. But we do have to keep an eye on Joaquim Barbosa as well, right? He can fish in many waters, right? Of all the candidates out there, you can make the case that he has the best profile, right? Because he has a mixture of experience, credibility, and corruption, which makes him competitive in the Southeast. Comes from humble origins, black. He can also surf within the waters of the Northeast, but he's also the most untested. Right? So it's a mixed bag here. But I would say that Lula probably will not be a kingmaker, but absolutely where his voters go is going to be a key issue.
I agree with Chris. I think Lula will play a important role, but not necessarily will be the one who will really build the candidate that will be in the runoff. But I think the left will have someone in the runout. I think it's not necessarily the candidate from PT. I think besides Fernando Haddad and Jacques Wagner, I think Patrus Ananias may be an alternative for PT. Patrus Ananias is a guy who was the Minister of Social Development. He's a former mayor of Belo Horizonte. He's not involved in car wash operation. He's very close to Lula. Maybe a guy who can play the role of PT candidate. I'm not sure if the PT candidate, I think in the end, the candidate from PT can have more than 10%. I think they can reach easily 15%, and depend on the performance of the other candidates with 15% or something around that. They may reach the runoff, but I'm not sure if this scenario will prevail, but someone from the left, I think, will be there. Maybe Joaquim Barbosa, but there is a question if Joaquim Barbosa will really be a candidate for PSB. I think PSB is not defined to accept someone like him to be candidate, so we will have to wait a little bit to see if Barbosa would be an alternative for the left. Ciro Gomes, I think, has a lot of restraints for performing in this election. I think he has a lack of resource in terms of political party, in terms of money, in terms of support for other political leaders, and he has a combination of attributes that not necessarily will create a good environment for him to perform as a leader. I think by default, even the PT candidate may be the one who will be in the runoff. And let me just say that I'm not optimist. I think I'm pragmatic. And I think the Brazilian population is pragmatic. If you see what happened in the last local election in Brazil, the mayor's election 2 years ago, in which the mood in Brazil was similar to today, and check what happened with the candidates that was elected. You know, of course, if you have candidates like João Dória in São Paulo City, that combines this idea of outsider, someone new in politics, with a strong structure behind him, he was a perfect candidate to be there, but not necessarily to be the outsider. Dória, without the support of the broad coalition that Alckmin gave to him, I'm not sure if Dória would be elected, basically in social media. I think if you take the election in Amazon state, just last year, who was elected? Amazonino Mendes. Amazonino Mendes is the most traditional politician in Amazon region. He was elected last year. So we have to check this mood with the pragmatic decisions. If you ask me who we are in New York, who would like to have an affair in New York, I would say Michelle Pfeiffer. Would we focus everything when I'm in New York to have an affair with Michelle Pfeiffer? No, this is my idea, this is my mood, this is not necessarily what I'm going to do. So you ask the guy, who would like to have a perfect outsider? 70% will say yes. Okay, do you have this guy? No. Okay, let's check pragmatically, what would be the options? I think this is the case. If you take right now, for instance, add the support of Lula, 30%, Alckmin, 80%, with Álvaro Dias. You have right now 60% of the voters are supporting traditional politicians, not outsiders. So you said that 60% decide not votes in traditional politicians, not involved in car wash operation. Okay, right now within your pools, yours pools also, 70% said, okay, I prefer to vote for the guy. So you need to combine this. I agree with the mood is a critical fact. I don't think this is the only fact that will make the decision of the people in terms of votes. This is my question. It is important. And I think Chris made this comment. How much important is these factors? I think it's 30%, 25%. I don't think it's more than that. I use basically Uber and cab in bicycle in São Paulo. I was in a ride with in this cab, and I asked the drivers who are about politics. So he presented exactly the mood you indicated. He hates every politician, etc., etc., etc. My final question was, well, you are about to vote for mayor. You will vote for this guy or this guy? He said, depend if he support Uber or not. I said, well, but you said you hate the traditional politician. Okay, but I need to live by my cab. If this guy, he said a very bad word. He says, if the guy decide to legalize Uber, I'm finished. So I will decide my vote based on Uber issue. That, I think, the point that we are right now. I think Brazilian middle class is pragmatic. I think they make decisions in the end, combining this general mood and perception about the general environment in Brazil with concrete decisions. The housing program, family grant, access to the public education, issue of gender, all of these things, of course, you need to combine this. This is basically my argument. I'm not saying that all these elements are not important. I'm just saying that there is a lot of issues in risk. The value at stake in decisions in Brazil right now is critical. And I think the people understand that somehow. That's why I think the role of the leaders, local leaders, priests or the evangelical leaders are critical. They will check, look, it is really important to have this decision or that decision. So I think this is critical. Again, if you take the evangelics in general, the evangelics has a very pragmatic approach to votes. Even though they have this mood, he decided for someone close to his beliefs. That's why 30%, 34% of Brazil are evangelics, and you do have someone similar to that in the Congress. I think this is my point. I'm not a crazy man, a traditional guy that said, look, all these pools is crazy. I'm saying this is important, but let's combine this with some pragmatic elements that will create, I think, the real decision-making process. This is my point.
Okay. Let me just ask last question to this side of the table, and then we will open the microphone for Q&A. So if you do have questions, please start thinking about them. My question to Mauricio and to Thiago is really about social media. For the first time, politicians will be able to buy ads, political ads on Facebook. And we are also seeing an interesting discussion about fake news. So Mauricio, I would ask you specifically to make a comment on how do you think fake news can affect campaigns directly. And Thiago, I think it would be interesting to hear from you how these new movements are using, not only Facebook, but WhatsApp as a tool to mobilize. And did we learn anything from campaigns like Macron in France when, you have to combine social media with something else to get people to vote for you, and how you do that, this transition?
Can I just make a point about the point that Ricardo made? My experience in elections, in campaigns, is that local elections are very different from national elections. And the local elections are much more issue-related, is the street, is the local hospital, is the school on the neighborhood. So it's a completely different narrative, it's a completely different mood. So I don't compare. But even if I want to compare, the three major cities in Brazil are run, one by a evangelical priest in Rio, the most progressive city. Can you imagine that? The other one is the president of a soccer club in Belo Horizonte. And João Dória, before the election, was a TV show apprentice presenter. So you guys know the show. But even though in those three cities, the real winner was not the guys that actually were elected. The real winner, the people that no vote, blank vote, plus people that had no show, they won in São Paulo, they won in Rio, they won in Amazonas. So it's a different ballpark. When I'm seeing today that those people that are mad didn't vote can do like a protest vote in this election, and have to be very careful on that. But having said that, on one topic that Christopher has mentioned, the last Datafolha, they underestimate the PT because when they asked the question, they just showed the names of Haddad and Jacques Wagner, not mention anything about PT or Lula support. So they underestimate. Talking about the fake news, one thing that I learned about today, every election has fake news since the beginning of time. So that's the first. The difference today is that it's very easy to disseminate fake news. So we have much more platforms that you can disseminate very fast. And this is an issue of every election. So and of course, the one thing about the WhatsApp that nobody sees what being disseminated. So this is a big issue. This affects all campaigns that I've worked, and it's growing. So one thing that all the campaigns, the professional campaigns are doing right now is to have like a group of people just monitoring what's out there and making sure that the time that they found out about the fake news and the time that they release the truth is a very short time, because this is what makes effective you. And another thing that I always praise as professor is that we need to teach the new generation to deal with news, to start checking things that they receive. This is something that I always tell my students. The fake news, they have like a lot of things that are very common. They come from websites that nobody is giving any signature. They usually come names of websites that are very similar to real names. So they usually combine opinions with some facts that are not related. So the fake news is very easy to identify. So the people have, on the demand side, we need to inform the voters the basic. But this is a real threat, and it's growing. And I don't see the other way without, they need to monitor and respond. So there's not a way to treat that.
Did we learn something? It's first, just to catch the debate that Mauricio left here. Using my other hat, I am a member of the consulting group on fake news of the Superior Electoral Court in Brazil. And we have that kind of concern of what would be the impact of fake news on the elections results. As we learned from the American experience in the Brexit, fake news seems to engage more those that are already followers of that kind of thought. And our concern right now is how to educate people on differentiate what is fake, and we have a big challenge right now because not only fake news but deep fake. You can, using a phone app, you can create the voice and image of a person saying whatever you want to say. And there's experience that have been done using Obama's face to say a lot of bad words about Trump. And so we have to have this in mind because it will get worse. So it will come a time when we won't be able to really identify what is a real video or a fake video, and this time is very, very close to get real. But using that as a legitimate political platform, we are making a good use because we have a strong concern of creating an organic growth. Because we believe that once the ads are free to go, there will be a lot of ads and people will be more prone to just skip those ads. So unless you have an organic audience, paying for ads won't do much of a difference unless you spend a low bucket of money on that. So we are now focused on creating a growing audience in an online to offline strategy, just like Uber, Airbnb, and iFood. So we have the platform as an anchor to our communication, but we have street field activities every single week. So there's not a weekend that goes by without our group on the Paulista Avenue on São Paulo trying to engage with people. There's not a week that goes by without our people in Belo Horizonte or Rio de Janeiro doing the same kind of interactions. Right now, those interactions are led by those people that will be candidates because they have more available time. They are living just for that right now, so they have more available time to be on that. But all of us, all of our groups are interacting with people, not just, Harvard Club people. We are interacting with the little guy in a week basis. So, and we use the social media to make the anchor of this communication. So our strategy is online to offline, and when election comes closer, we plan to do on a door-to-door basis. So just like Macron did, and we are, Mauricio helped us to create a link with the Guillaume, what's her in French? I don't have, Guillaume Legueux. And pardon my French, please. And we are in touch with him and trying to create strategies to really have a door-to-door action to get to know the Brazilian people more and more. Luciano Huck, for instance, visits 2 different states every week. And he has been in all the Brazilian states, in all the different backgrounds of people. So we are trying to gather all the data, the knowledge that we are producing right now to know how to touch people's hearts and minds.
Great. Let me open the floor for Q&A. A few basic rules. Please identify yourself and put a question mark in the end. Okay. Thank you.
Hello. Right here. Sure. Hi. Very nice panel. My name is Edson, and I represent the Brazilian media, afropress.com. And my question regarding the political environment right now. You guys didn't talk about three important things, in my opinion. The intervention in Rio and how that's going to affect the incoming election. Human rights, another big issue in Brazil. And regarding the death of Marielle Franco, who was against the intervention, and she was fighting for human rights, and she got killed recently in Rio. So how this is going to affect the election in the next election in Brazil?
Three very important points indeed. Anyone?
Thanks for the question. I have some numbers. I don't want to give my personal opinion on that, but I will share some numbers. By the weekend that the president gave the authorization for the intervention, 75% of the state of Rio residents were in favor of the intervention. On the other hand, 81% said that the intervention was not the solution. But 1 month after the intervention and after what happened with Vereadora Marielle, only 54% were in favor of the intervention, and 62% said nothing has changed in Rio after the intervention. But on top of that, we run the survey in other states, and one thing that strikes me was that in Pernambuco, 71% of the voters said that Pernambuco needed an intervention, a military intervention. So what my point is, this is going to be a presidential issue and it's going to be discussed a lot.
Yeah, if I can just add real quick. I mean, I think from a political point of view in the election, the knee-jerk reaction of many pundits was to say that if the federal government intervenes in the state of Rio de Janeiro and it is a successful intervention that wedded to an economic rebound, that maybe President Temer's numbers could start to rise and he could be relevant in this election. And obviously we're seeing that was very wishful thinking. His numbers are not going to go anywhere. It's a very difficult thing to do so. But the net impact is that it elevates security to be an even higher issue to be discussed in this election, right? And to the extent that security becomes more of a tier 1 issue, I think that helps Jair Bolsonaro, because part of the presidential campaign is to dictate what are the issues that are being discussed. Now, of course, I understand that Marielle's assassination puts Bolsonaro in a little bit of a difficult position on the one hand, right? So it is uncomfortable for his bid and all the issues of what was behind the assassination, but at the end of the day, you're still talking about security. And that's favorable terrain for Bolsonaro, I think, in the margin. I don't think it's something that necessarily hurts him.
Let me address the issue of human rights. I think there is not an issue for this election. I think social issue it is. In Brazil, unfortunately, I think human rights is not an issue, public debate in election time. But social issues and social policies, I think, are the key factor, including, I think, safety, but also issues related to employment, strategy to address the income inequality in terms of income distribution. These issues, I think, are really critical. And the candidate that managed to present a more consistent idea about this, that is not exactly, I would say, Cartesian proposal, but the general idea about how to promote that, I think will benefit from this time. For instance, candidates like Bolsonaro, who has approaching, I think it's a completely fake approach to the liberal agenda, economic agenda. It's completely fake. There isn't any connection between Bolsonaro and a liberal agenda. Any link is completely fake. But these guys, even though trying to make this link, they have raised issues like we need to privatize the Banco do Brasil, we need to privatize Petrobras, we need to privatize. The way of the average citizen in Brazil take this information is this guy is against the state promotion of social inclusion, etc., etc., etc. So I think my point here is, besides all these mood, etc., social issues, economic issues continue to be the central piece of the decision of the citizens in Brazil.
I don't want to monopolize it, but you say that 60,000 people who die in Brazil, this is not a human rights issue, it's just social?
No. I'd say I agree with you. I didn't say the way I understand that the citizenship in Brazil and the voters in Brazil understand the issue of human rights. No, I fully agree with that. It is a human rights issue. But my point is, it's not an electoral issue in Brazil. Unfortunately, I would love to say the opposite, but I think it's not an issue in Brazil.
Do we have time for one more question? Yep.
Carlos Guimarães from LEIG Investments, and my question is for Ricardo Senes. You seem to be more optimistic with Geraldo Alckmin's campaign, even though the polls don't represent that. In your view, do you see the possibility that the polls continue to reflect what they reflect today, that the PSDB and probably President Cardoso tries a maneuver of substituting Alckmin for João Doria? And if that happens, what in your view would be the traction that Doria would have with the voters, which want change? Using your words, do you think he could be the Michelle Pfeiffer?
That's a tough one.
Yeah, tough one. No, I agree. I think the Alckmin has a lot of challenges to face, including some internal fights on PSDB. But I think after the end of the windows that allowed politicians to change the parties and also the governors and presidents to leave the office in order to be candidate, we have a more consolidated scenario right now. I think there is no chance, in my perception, for other candidate in PSDB than Alckmin. There is no chance. Even though Fernando Henrique Cardoso wants to have another one, it's impossible. Alckmin is the president of PSDB. He was 4 times governor of the state of São Paulo, the largest state in São Paulo. He has a quite good rate of approval in São Paulo. It's 42%, 43%. It's impossible to have an argument to take Alckmin out for Doria. Doria ran and won the election for mayor. Again, basically on support of Alckmin, huge coalition. That's why the critical fact. The second is Doria left the position of mayor of São Paulo with 20% of support. 20%. He dropped, in just 1 year, he dropped from 60-something to 20%. So it's not an issue. Doria, I think, is not the question. I think the point is, would be possible for Alckmin really to organize his campaign, is a point, an aspect that Mauricio raised last week in São Paulo. This is critical because what happened with Lula in the capacity, the electoral capacity of Lula? Lula, of course, is a very charismatic guy, but besides that, he's 100% professional in organizing election, 100% a professional. And also to raise money from corruption. He's also professional on that. But in terms of electoral, and the PSDB is amazing how these people are bad in organizing election. It's crazy because right now is the case of Aécio Neves in the last election, 2014. I think everything was in favor of him. Not everything, but he has all the capacity to be the winner. And his campaign was a disaster. So this, I think, is the challenge. The challenge is not someone else take the position of Alckmin, but the capacity of Alckmin to build a coalition that I think he has this capacity. We heard this weekend that he has invited in the talks with Mendonça Filho from Pernambuco has moved on. So as a vice president, candidate for vice president, would be an interesting move. For 2 reasons. One, Alckmin will have someone, an important leader in Pernambuco. Pernambuco will have a coalition of 4 different parties to run for a governor, PMDB, PSDB, Democrats, and PTB. So we will bring part of this coalition to the support of Alckmin. And also, he has this first step on building PSDB Democrats coalition. That would be, I think, the first step for build. So I think the challenge is basically a challenge for Alckmin himself and his team. This would be the problem, not Doria, etc.
Chris wants to make a last comment.
Oh, okay. You asked a question.
How is the political risk affecting the legal risk of companies in Brazil? Especially when we are all businessmen here thinking about investing in Brazil. How is this political situation affecting the legal risk that companies have there?
Yeah, I would say, I'll answer that question. And what I would say is that obviously, from an operational point of view, you can look at this election as having two implications. The first is, are we going to produce someone who can deliver the necessary economic adjustments that Brazil needs? Brazil is running a primary deficit of 2.5 percentage points of GDP. The fiscal position is completely unsustainable, and the expectations that they will be addressed are critical to keep the currency stabilized and have a, let's say, minimally predictable time horizon to be able to make investments. So if we get elected president that does not address these much needed fiscal reforms, then the operating environment from a macroeconomic point of view, I think, will be much more challenging. That's number one. But number two, what I would say is, and this is more talking about these legal investigations in Lava Jato, how should you think about this as a company operating in Brazil? There's a lot of debate in Brazil whether or not the Lava Jato investigations can be undermined. The Supreme Court is ruling on certain cases that can impact the various different tenets of the Lava Jato probe, like, if you are condemned and you lose an appeal, then you have to start serving your prison sentence after you lose an appeal, rather than being able to appeal up to 10 years out of jail all the way to the Supreme Court. So there's a lot of kind of chatter in Brazil over, can the empire come back, right? Can they kind of undermine the basis of the Lava Jato? I think that our view at the Origin Group is that the amount of evidence that has been collected, the constitutional independence of the prosecutor's office, the 2013 anti-corruption law, that the basis of these investigations is so robust that it's very hard for us to go back to where we were before. And it also means that if you're a company doing business in Brazil, you have to appreciate that we're in an era of hyperactive judicial investigations. So that's not going to go away anytime soon, all right? So I think that that's something that is a new normal, all right, that I would say. The one thing I would say just on the corruption investigations, and make one small hook with Ricardo's, or the question on Alckmin, is there's only one caveat to everything that Ricardo said, which I agree with. I think politically, Alckmin is the man within the PSDB, but if Lava Jato investigations hit him hard before the campaign, then that's the only scenario where I see of a switch. And for him to be, this is a huge vulnerability, even if he isn't hit directly. Just having headlines of Lava Jato probe against him is a real problem for him, right? So Alckmin's got the problem of the candidates being associated with corruption. He has a problem of Álvaro Dias eating his traditional base in the South. And if you add candidates like Amoedo or even Flávio Rocha that can eat a little bit more, and then you add Joaquim Barbosa that also is competing, that's a tough. The real despair for Alckmin is to make it to second round runoff. If he makes a second round runoff, I think he'll probably win. But that's his real risk. And so anyway, but I think that the corruption side is the only caveat that I would give to Carlos.
Just to add to this question in a quick manner, there is none. Let me just calm your heart down. There is none. Actually, the legal system is so solid that the political risk is being addressed right now. So we are not a common law country, so everything must be written down in bills of law. So unless things take a drastic turn towards an authoritarian government, there is no legal risk that comes from political political environment. You can be sure of that.
With that,
yeah, I regret having to make this announcement, but I have to close this panel. I've been told the catering staff needs to turn this room for lunch. I wanted to thank you all for the provocative discussion. I know we have many questions left, including my own, but I think the panelists will be joining us for the network reception, hopefully on the third floor, and so you'll have a chance to ask the questions that went unasked here in this session, and we will be adjourning here promptly at 1:15 for our luncheon and our keynote speaker by Marcos Troja. Can I get a round of applause for this panel?